Unsolved or cold cases often go one of two ways. Either there's not enough information available for us to come to a solid conclusion, or the answer feels extremely obvious, but there's a lack of evidence tying the suspect to the crime. Sometimes this is because a suspect was careful or got lucky. Sometimes it's due to botched police work. Whatever the case may be, it can be maddening to watch as these kinds of cases, the ones that are so close to being solved, are shelved. In today's episode, we'll be exploring two frustrating cold cases with obvious suspects. Brett Winn. Brett William Winn was 24 years old when he vanished in the winter of 1989. At the time, he was engaged to his long-term girlfriend Carolyn and was working as an assistant manager at Hallett Cove Foodland, a local supermarket. The couple lived in the village of Port Noarlunga, located just 18.5 miles south of Adelaide city centre in South Australia. At around 8 p.m. on November 16, 1989, Brett got into a white Ford sedan, which had pulled up into his driveway. The vehicle backed out of the drive, and the pair headed off. Carolyn watched him go and waved him off, but didn't recognize the driver. Later that evening, Brett called Carolyn to let her know he'd be home soon. That was the last time anyone heard from the 24-year-old, as he never came back that night. That same evening, Brett's workplace was robbed. The perpetrators gained access to the front door with a key, used an employee PIN code to disable the alarm system, and had the combination to the safe. Using this, they stole $60,000 from the store. As Brett didn't return home that night, authorities surmised that he was the robber's inside man, and he had gone on the run after stealing the cash with his accomplices. Little is known about the initial investigation into Brett's disappearance. It appears that the case went cold quickly. It wasn't until 1997 that things began to pick up again, when, after appealing to the public for help, law enforcement received a tip from an anonymous person claiming that the 24-year-old wasn't on the run, but had in fact been murdered. This led investigators to believe that Brett was part of a 3-man gang suspected of robbing several local supermarkets in the months before he went missing. Before the caller hung up, they told authorities that a man named David was involved, but they would not elaborate further and declined to provide detectives with this man's full name. 2 years later, law enforcement identified 2 men as possibly being part of Brett's robbery gang. One man was named David Christopher Cox, while the other has never been publicly identified for legal reasons. Both suspects admitted to knowing Brett, but claimed that they knew nothing about his disappearance, denied any knowledge that he was murdered, and rejected the notion that they were involved in the spate of robberies committed just before the 24-year-old vanished. In 2002, authorities were contacted again by a tipster who told them that Brett's body had initially been dumped at the side of a road in Cape Jervis, roughly 1 hour from his residence, but that it had been moved afterwards. A few days later, the 24-year-old's body was moved to the home of David Cox, who lived at Hackham West, less than 10 minutes from Brett's house. The caller confessed that they were an acquaintance of David's and helped him move the body from Cape Jervis. According to the tipster, once they arrived at David's house, they discovered that a grave had already been dug underneath the floorboards of his bedroom. The body was put into a surf bag before being buried. Shortly after investigators received this call, they went to the house specified by the tipster and found Brett's skeletal remains in a surf bag underneath the bedroom floorboards. His cause of death has not been mentioned in the articles about his case. 2 years later, in 2004, David Cox was charged with Brett's murder. Yet, despite having the testimony of the unidentified caller, and despite finding the body in his old residence, David walked free after a jury returned a not guilty verdict. His defense argued that many of the key witnesses for the prosecution were untrustworthy and of poor character, noting that the majority of them were heavily involved with drugs in 1989, and some went on to have mental issues afterwards, making them unreliable. Some years later, David committed suicide. Despite his death, Brett's younger sister Naomi hopes justice will catch up with the other unidentified man who was part of the robbery gang. She noted that initially, the family thought Brett simply needed some time out by himself and that he took off and would come home soon. So when he didn't, it left them heartbroken. The discovery of his body did, however, help, she told the Sunday Mail. When Brett was found, it was sort of a relief to my parents. They could finally put him to rest and try and start the healing process. One Reddit user who also discussed the case stated that for almost a year after Brett's disappearance, his fiancée Carolyn received weekly food deliveries that were sometimes bought by a man she later identified as Cox. Reportedly, the deliveries ceased when she started a new relationship. There is some speculation online that this was done to make Carolyn think Brett was alive, although at this time, it is unclear what the truth is. Brett Winn's case is still unsolved. Crime Stoppers is still offering a reward of up to $200,000 for any information that will lead to a conviction in the case. If you have any information about Brett's disappearance and subsequent murder, you can contact Crime Stoppers on 1-800-333-000. The Thompson Family. 40-year-old Everett Arthur Thompson was known as a generous, caring, and hard-working husband and father in 1996. Originally from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, he was born in March of 1956 to Herman and Earlene Thompson and was the second oldest of 6 children. In high school, he was an athlete and a talented trombone player, participating in the school band at Hampton Institute in Virginia. After leaving school, he entered university, where he graduated with a degree in marketing in 1978. Following this, he moved to Chicago, where he worked for a steel manufacturing firm and met Lydia White. The couple married in 1982 and continued to remain in the Chicago area. They had 2 children, 11-year-old Everett Jr. and 8-year-old Andrew. Eventually, Everett Sr. gave up his job and decided to chase his passions, opening EAT & Company, a restaurant on Lawrence Avenue and 71st Street, Chicago. The EAT stood for his name. The family settled well into their home in the 8100 block of South Rhodes Avenue and were known by neighbors to be pleasant and quiet, mostly keeping to themselves. But things took a turn when in February of 1996, Lydia's brother Kenneth came to stay with them. He was fresh out of prison after serving a term for sexual assault. He was known to have had a long criminal history, consisting of 4 convictions for sexual assault and 2 for burglary. Although it wasn't an ideal situation, Lydia was living in her father's house. The property had been left equally to Lydia, her brother, and the pair's sister Phyllis, who resided in New Mexico. As a result, she wasn't able to simply kick Kenneth out of the home. The Thompson family were, by all accounts, unhappy with Kenneth's presence, a quarrelsome and violent man that had nothing but trouble since he'd come to stay. Everett's family described his brother-in-law as a freeloading house guest. On July 3rd, 1996, Lydia called emergency services when Kenneth threatened to kill her with an axe. According to Chicago Police Lieutenant Robert Harsheimer, by the time police officers arrived on the scene to defuse the situation, they found everything quiet and calm. Harsheimer added, "There was no ongoing trouble, nothing that stood out." As a result of the calm, the police made no arrests. Then, 2 days later, on July 5th, Herman Thompson called his son while he was at the restaurant, and the pair made conversation for a short time until Lydia called Everett. She frantically begged her husband to come home, claiming that Kenneth had chased her around the house with an axe and that she had locked herself in the bedroom. Everett hastily informed his father about the phone call and hung up so he could head home. He was seen by one of his employees leaving the restaurant at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That was the last time anybody ever saw Everett or any other member of the Thompson family. 2 hours later, Kenneth entered the restaurant to tell one of the managers that Everett had been arrested following a car accident. He did not elaborate further and left again, getting into Everett's van. The manager noticed just before Kenneth left that there were red streaks on his white trainers. 12 days later, on July 17th, Everett's parents, who still resided in Philadelphia, asked the Chicago police to perform a welfare check on the family, as they hadn't been heard from since July 5th. While officers went to the door of the family home, they found no sign of the Thompsons. It was Kenneth who answered. He told the police that the family had gone to Philadelphia. It's unclear why investigators didn't question this further, considering it was Everett's Philadelphia-based parents who had contacted them in the first place. As the family van was also missing, officers assumed the Thompsons had taken it on their trip and didn't investigate further. At this time, they felt there was no evidence that foul play had occurred. Over the next few weeks, Kenneth gave various different accounts about where the family had gone. He said that they'd taken the bus to Philadelphia, that they'd gone to visit Minneapolis by bus, or that they'd gone to Hawaii. He took no care in keeping his story straight, but still, law enforcement failed to act. Eventually, Kenneth was arrested while driving the Thompsons' van. He was apprehended because he'd falsified Lydia's signature on a check. However, officers didn't make the connection between Kenneth driving the van and his earlier claim that the family had taken the van and driven to Philadelphia. As a result, he was never questioned further at this time, nor was the van inspected or searched. Frustrated by law enforcement's lack of interest in the case, Everett's parents went to Chicago looking for answers. They investigated the disappearance on their own and spoke with employees of Eat and Company, but found no new clues. Failing to dig up anything helpful, they once again turned to the police for help, asking them to investigate. It was then that the restaurant manager, who'd spoken with Kenneth on July 5th, revealed their brief interaction to police. Detectives, however, found no record of Everett being in an accident, nor being arrested that day. Finally, looking further into the case, investigators discovered that since the Thompsons had disappeared, Kenneth had forged the signatures of both his sisters so that he could sell their father's property. A real estate inspector who'd visited the house shortly before its sale noticed that one toilet and one bathtub in the bathroom had been painted red, and that the floor in the kitchen had been completely ripped out. Authorities concluded that these changes had been made after the family went missing, as officers who'd responded to Lydia's 911 call on July 3rd had examined the house at the time and noticed the kitchen floor was intact, and there were no red bathroom fixtures. However, by the time law enforcement uncovered the illegal state of the house, the new owners had already moved in and begun gutting it for renovations. In the following weeks and months, Kenneth was interviewed on numerous occasions, but the police never had probable cause for an arrest. Shortly after the sale of his father's home, he moved into a trailer in Gary, Indiana. In July of 1997, just about a year after the family had been last seen, the FBI searched in and around Kenneth's trailer. Inside, they found a pair of men's tennis shoes. Under the crawl space, they found a child's sock. Both were blood-stained, and testing showed that the blood was human. It was also discovered that Kenneth had sold the Thompson family's van to a salvage yard, and it had been compacted, destroying any and all potential evidence. Several months later, in November of 1997, Kenneth was arrested for failing to register as a sex offender. He was released, but arrested again the following month for bank fraud. He had forged Lydia's name on a check for over $13,000. During the court hearing about his fraud charges, the prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jacqueline Ross, claimed that Kenneth had axe-murdered the Thompson family. She said, "The surrounding circumstances provide substantial evidence the defendant axe-murdered his sister, her husband, and their 2 children. The offense is bank fraud, but it is the government's position that the murders were carried out in furtherance of that crime." The theory put forward by the prosecution and investigators is that the property of Lydia and Kenneth's father had become available to them while Kenneth was serving his prison sentence. By the time he was released, his sister and her family had already moved in, possibly resenting having to share the home, or perhaps just looking for the money he could gain if he sold it. Kenneth decided to kill the family so he could get what he wanted. On December 25th, 1997, at 4 a.m., Kenneth took his own life using a bedsheet while in his jail cell at the Federal Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago. He left no note and no information that would lead investigators to the Thompson family or their remains. Law enforcement believes that Kenneth White killed the family between July 5th and July 6th of 1996, but there was simply never enough evidence to charge him. Unfortunately, there might have been evidence had authorities acted quicker. The fact that 12 days passed before they were even reported missing in the first place may have hindered the investigation. Neither the family home nor Kenneth's trailer turned up any sign of human remains. The disappearance of the Thompson family is still unresolved. If you have any information about their whereabouts, you can contact the Chicago Police Department on 312-746-6000. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.